Namaskar. Hello and welcome to PGurus channel. I'm your host Sree Iyer. I have today two new guests and they are joining me for the first time. I have met them in the past, but this is the first time they are coming on PGurus channel. So let's welcome Dr. Kundan Singh and Krishna Maheshwari. Dr. Singh, uh, Dr. Singh, Krishna Maheshwari ji, Namaskar. Welcome to PGurus channel.
Namaskar.
So, Krishna ji, when you reached out to me about your new book, I was reminded of 2-3 years ago when I met Dr. Kundan Singh. When I met Dr. Kundan Singh, and he had mentioned that this was the caste thing was just beginning to pick up momentum at that point of time, and he said that to pick up this book, you will need it. And boy, did I need it! It really helped me understand some of the nuances about the McGraw-Hill textbooks, how they have fashioned the entire thing about Hinduism. And there were some other things that I have been involved in. So I kind of knew what was going on. So this new book of yours, Colonial Discourse and the Suffering of Indian American Children, a Francophone post-colonial analysis. Thank you so much for putting that up. Colonial Discourse and the Suffering of Indian American Children. Having had my children grow up here, I can immediately connect with what you're saying. It's a hit and miss. Some of our children immediately absorb Hinduism, Sanatana Dharma, and others are actually they go to the other extreme. So between these two, you also have a few kids who kind of will do it for you. They'll go to the temple with you, but really where their moorings are when they go to college, how they shape their views. It's sometimes a shocker when they come back for like the first break after a semester or something like that, and you see, wait a minute, is this the guy that left the door 4 months ago? Something like that. So this idea of writing this book, how did it occur to both of you? I'll start with you, Krishnaji.
So when we wrote the first book, it was after we had won in California, and won really means we got one publisher, Houghton Mifflin Harcourt, banned for a decade. But all the other publishers passed through with very small changes to the materials. So this book was, here is what is wrong with the textbooks based on the facts that we believe in as a community. But it was my facts versus someone else's facts, and the other facts, the someone else's facts, were the ones that were privileged. At the beginning of every chapter in that book, we state this violates certain codes of the California Constitution. Now, the question is, what is the meaningful proof behind that statement? And we didn't have a means to prove it. We just knew it intuitively, and so we stated it. And the state board didn't pay a lot of attention to it. And we needed that underpinning. So in a lot of ways, this book is the prequel, because it establishes the underpinnings behind that one-line statement in the front of every chapter of the other book. Now, what is the California Constitution? Now, there's a couple of different clauses, but if I put it simply and generally, is when a student learns these instructional materials, when they learn about India and Hinduism in textbooks in grades 6 and 7, at the other end of that learning, they should feel secure and comfortable in their heritage. That's a fundamental tenet. And kids don't. That's a proven fact. This book now connects the dots. How did we get there? What is the basis for the narrative? And then, fundamentally, what is the impact on kids in a way that's academically proven? And I'll also note this work went through peer review, so it is literally academically proven now, and coming out of an academic publisher. So this work, in a lot of ways, is the prequel to the first book, done Star Wars style.
Wonderful, Krishna. And Dr. Kundan Singh, you and Krishna have written this book also, Making Children Hindu-Phobic. And it's a wonderful read, by the way, viewers. If you have not read it, do read this book. And Dr. Kundan Singh, how did you come about in this project? Did both of you figure out that, hey, we need to do this kind of a prequel stuff so that the stage is set for people to understand how things led up to here? How did that back and forth happen between the two of you?
Yeah, it's a very interesting story. Krishna and I met by chance, actually. But before I talk about that meeting, I want to take you into the background of how I figured out academic Hinduphobia. So my PhD is from the California Institute of Integral Studies. And my dissertation connects the vision and thoughts of Sri Aurobindo on one side with the vision and thoughts of Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda on the other side. So while I was writing my dissertation, I was asked by my dissertation supervisor to undergo a literature review of things that were available on all the three protagonists. Now, interestingly, what I found out through that process was that there is a lot of trash which has been written on Swami Vivekananda in academia. I read 990 articles on JSTOR on Swami Vivekananda, and most of them had a very negative representation on Swami Vivekananda. So this was my first exposure to academic Hinduphobia. And interestingly, my dissertation chair uh, believed that the things that had been written on Swami Vivekananda were true. So you can understand the difficulty that I had in getting through my dissertation, in earning my PhD. But by the grace of the divine and through the dint of hard work, it happened. Now, in 2015, I was approached by a couple of organizations here in the Bay Area to fight the textbook battle. And that was my first exposure to the text that you find in the textbooks. Now, by then, I had already taught for about 6 years at Sophia University, and one of the courses that I teach is cultural psychology. So, when you teach cultural psychology, you become familiar with the different kinds of relationships that have existed amongst cultures, between Western and non-Western cultures primarily. And what you begin to find out is that the non-Western cultures have been badly represented. And at this point in time, if I use the academic terminology, one can say that Orientalism is written large over the representations of the non-Western cultures. So when I started going through the textbook materials, I could very clearly see that the tropes were colonial and Orientalist in representation, in orientation. And the group with which I was working was more interested in refuting the discourse on the basis of evidence. And I began to say that, look, this approach is not going to work because this representation is political. There's a nexus between politics and knowledge over here. So you basically need to expose the underlying racism which is there in this discourse. That is what you need to do. But it was a motley group at that point in time, and people were not really willing to buy what I was saying. They wanted to pursue with the approach that they had taken. I continued to work with that group, had many discussions and debates, and with that approach, I was able to add some teeth, if you will, to the contestation that this group was making. But I knew that the textbook discourse will not really get altered significantly. So while the textbook revision process was going on, I also went to Sacramento to depose against the textbook representation and talk about the problems that were there. And that is where I met Krishna. And we started talking. And when we started talking, we realized that there was this very natural camaraderie between the two of us. We saw things very similarly. So it took us some time to start working together because I also went to India at that point in time. My father was not doing well. I was taking care of him. But Krishna and I continued to converse. And while this exchange was happening, there were two interventions that we made separate from each other, which bore significant results. I will talk about my approach first, because chronologically it comes first, and then I'll talk about what Krishna did. So after the framework was finalized, framework is basically the syllabus, which the California State Board of Education, through Instructional Quality Commission, comes up with, which it gives to the publishers to create draft books. And these draft books are uh, basically gone through by different committees in order to see whether they are in line with the framework or not. So when the framework got created, I could see that not much had changed, and the problems were uh, quite significant. So I took a deep critical look at the syllabus, at the framework, and wrote a letter to the State Board of Education, to the Instructional Quality Commission. It's in the appendix section of this book, and there I told them quite clearly that, look, you have so many lines in your framework, so many words in your framework on Hinduism in India, and anywhere between 80 to 85% of that discourse revolves around this equation: Hinduism equals caste equals hierarchy equals oppression. And then I began to talk about the education code violations that this framework was engaging in. What were the education code violations, and I basically put that in front of them to take notice of. After that, I uh, left for India. There's a prominent individual, here in the Bay Area, who took the letter and had some conversations, with some officials at the State Board of Education. What happened after this was that, despite the fact that the process had been closed, the process was reopened and the framework was revised. And therefore, the current framework that you see does not have the problems that I had pointed out. The representation around Hinduism equals caste equals uh, hierarchy equals uh, oppression is still there, but the representation has significantly come down. It has, it's around 40%. It's still there, and it's quite significant. Now, despite this change in the framework, the draft textbooks did not undergo any change. And at that point in time, Krishna and Hindupedia made a very significant intervention. And it is important that that people know about that intervention. So what Krishna did was that he critically analyzed, the contents of the two draft textbooks of HMH. And through the hearing that took place at IQC, the two draft textbooks of HMH were rejected. And that sent tremors in the publishing world. HMH had a decline in its stock market by 14%, and I would not go into the details. It really helped. It really hit the publishing company hard. And while Krishna was doing this, I was away in India. So he single-handedly kind of took care of this issue. So when I came back to the US after having taken care of my father's health, Krishna approached me to work together with him, under the canopy of Hindupedia. And that's how our work started. That's how, we started interacting with each other. And because, we look at this world, through common lens, there has been this camaraderie, and it is basically this camaraderie which has resulted in these two books. First it was Making Children Hindu-phobic, which we followed up with Colonial Discourse and the Suffering of Indian American Children. So, Krishna, do you want to add something about the the draft textbook process? Then I'll add something more. I don't want to be
I'll
speaking
add
so much.
something to how we met. So when we ran into each other in Sacramento, there was one professor speaking on behalf of Hindus. That was Professor Singh. He had no business to be there. He wasn't paid to be there. He just showed up. Every other professor was an anti-Hindu who was there because they were paid to be there. Right? So this is one person who showed up out of his own will. Everyone else on the from a Hindu perspective was leading an organization, and there was a few of us there, or participating at the behest of some organization. And not that they associated, but they were invited. The other thing is, we both saw things differently than everyone else. And I think this helped. We had a unique perspective, and we had different abilities to push them through. And later on, when we started working together, and through all our conversations, we could see that. We were different in our approach than everyone else, but we were similar to our approach with each other. And so that created a very unique bond. And so that's really how we started working together. We also knew something else, or at least I had an insight that was something else than everyone else, which was this is not work that can be won in the long term with part-time effort. It needed someone that was going to drive this work full-time, 100% of his focus. And so as part of us working together, Professor Singh has spent the last almost 5 years 100% dedicated to this effort. And so while we're here talking about the book that came out, what's hidden under the covers are a number of publications into peer-reviewed journals that led up to this work that the public will probably never see. They're all published in JSTOR behind paywalls, but they create the academic underpinning, not underpinning, the academic prelude or the prequel even to this book. Because in the academic world, if you put too much out once, then it's hard to get accepted. As it is, it was really hard to get this book through the process. And so we needed some things out before, and we needed them accepted in academia before we could bring this book out, just from a strategic perspective. And so that work had to happen and come out first.
Couple of things that come to my mind is having been in the thick of this stuff for the last few years myself, from PGurus' point of view, when I'm interviewing some politicians from either party, one of the things they try to kind of insist is that Hindu is different from Hindutva. They try to say Hindu is different from Hindutva. And then when you start explaining to them, look, these are Sanskrit words. Hindutva means being Hindu. The two are not separate, they are one and the same. And they will launch into things like sometimes ridiculous explanations. My mother told me that they are different. I mean, this can hardly be accepted as an explanation. I would rather the person say, I don't know. Maybe you can enlighten me why you think the two are same. And then use my argument against me and say that this is where you are wrong. So that's one. The second thing is Hinduism is, or being a Hindu, is something that others called us. In other words, for a German, it is Deutschland. For us, it is Germany. Similarly, for us, we are actually Sanatanis, followers of Sanatana Dharma. Now, this even we forgot because of we are coming out of a colonial period, and before that, 1,000 years of the Mughal rule. So, in this book of yours, have you tried to explain these critical concepts? Because we need to get these things away first before we start explaining why there are so many murtis, for example, and getting into a little bit more deeper stuff. Because our children really need to, they are very sharp, by the way, but the way we present the data to them makes all the difference. Krishna, I'll let you go first, and then Professor Singh can back up to that.
Yeah, so this book is a little bit different. We don't try to educate on Hindu Dharma at all. in this book,
Mm.
and that really wasn't our focus. Now, when you think about the world of Hindu Dharma, it's pretty big,
Yeah.
but there's a basis outside of it which we're constrained within. And your question on the definition of Hindutva is in part because of those constraints. And those constraints you also touched upon on the naming, which is whose constraints, who's applied the constraints, and then do you conform to those constraints or not? So what we're focused on is the world of constraints. Right? This book dives into a narrative that was invented. It's a piece of fiction, but it was invented by someone else. And unfortunately, it came to define who we are for the rest of the world. And so now you have a layer of constraints and definitions that the world created that was invented as a piece of fiction by one man and institutionalized globally. And now we're perpetually trying to define ourselves relative to that constraint and relative to that external definition. And I'm not talking the term Hindu here. I'm talking about Hindu Dharma in general. It's a much bigger and broader problem. And until you understand that constraint, you can't break free. You can fight it. You can give different definitions. You can twist yourself into a pretzel, but you cannot break free. And that's what this work is fundamentally about. The first 4 chapters out of the 6-chapter book were about making sure we understand that constraint. Academically, this is a deconstruction exercise.
So, Professor Singh, we go back in time. Now we are waking up to this in the 2000s, if you will, when we are saying, wait a minute, there are so many wrong representations about Hindutva, Hinduism, Sanatana Dharma in our books. But one would make the argument, look, it has been like this for decades. I don't know. I'm just saying, when did this whole thing start? Because I don't think it is just United States. I think it is the entire Western lens. That is this way, isn't it?
Yeah. So, there's a very interesting relationship between mind and narrative. Something which most people know. But when you look at our own cosmology, when you look at uh, our knowledge pursuit, if you look at epistemology, which is theory of knowledge, when you look at how the ultimate reality has to be found, and from the Sanatani perspective, how one becomes one with Brahma, then it becomes quite imperative for one to go past one's mind, because mind is just one layer of consciousness. It's an intermediary layer of consciousness, between the ultimate, which is Brahm, and the ultimate gross in which the Brahm has manifested, which is matter. So as long as we are in constant embedded in our mind, we won't be able to get past our mind, because of which we will not be able to find our union with the divine, with the ultimate. So in our tradition, deconstruction of mind has been given a lot of emphasis. And because there is an intimate connection between mind and narrative, or mind and discourse needs to be understood properly. Discourse has to be deconstructed in order to deconstruct mind, in order to go past mind, in order to attain one's union with the Brahman. So this is the larger framework, and within which it becomes incredibly important to critically examine a particular discourse. And in academia, there's something which we call genealogy of knowledge. Knowledge does not get created in a vacuum. There are always forces at work. So in the modern times, the discourse on Hinduism that you have, that has not been generated by the Hindus. It has been generated by someone else. It was generated in early 19th century. And as Krishna pointed out, that this work of fiction was institutionalized. And because it became institutionalized, it has become the dominant narrative. In fact, even the alternate narrative that we have is being created in relationship to this narrative, right? So at this point in time, there is no discourse on Hinduism which is beyond this narrative. And that is why it became incredibly important for us to go into the writings of this individual who created this narrative to begin with. And who is that individual? You know? And this is what we discuss in chapters 3 and 4. We talk about the writings of James Mill, who wrote the history of British India in 3 volumes, which was published in 1817. And this was the first comprehensive attempt by a colonial to write the history of India. And because this text began to exert a very profound uh, influence in the colonial world, we are still reeling under the effect of this discourse. And this discourse is sinister. It is sinister. It is sinister in the sense that the project of James Mill was to show Hinduism, and ancient India completely uncivilized and savage. And within this larger category, within this larger canopy, he wrote 7 chapters on Hindus. And in that, he describes, the social structure of Hindus, the Hindu governance coming from antiquity, Hindu laws coming from antiquity, Hindu taxation coming from antiquity, Hindu jurisprudence coming from antiquity, Hindu manners, customs, and so on and so forth. And as I pointed out earlier, the larger discourse is around uncivilization and barbarism. There was no political correctness in the times of James Mill. So he has used, all the synonyms of barbarianism on the Hindus quite liberally. The entire text is basically littered with it. So once again, I feel that I get into this monologue, so I will stop and I would request Krishna to come in, and then I will unfold the story. Together we will unfold the story more, because it is very important, for all of us to really understand what has happened in the past, which is exerting a profound influence on our present reality, whether we are in opposition or for. So both the pro and con approaches to Hinduism are actually colored by this discourse. So that's why it becomes very important for us to deconstruct the discourse.
From what little I know of, all these book curriculums and things like that, very few actually are practicing Sanatanis or Hindus. It's almost, when I say there are names that sound Hindu, but they actually are not. So to my utter disappointment, when I asked this question, people just got into a tangle, got their knickers into a twist. And I didn't know why that was so difficult. I said, if you are going to write a book about Hinduism, I would expect the board of experts who are writing this, panel of experts, that at least one of them would be practicing this religion. They didn't want to answer that question. And there were names that were, Hindu names there. So the thing is, this obfuscation has had many, many layers here. I think what I would like the next question to be, Krishnaji and Dr. Singh, is this book is like an eye-opener, not just for the people who are framing these standards, but also for parents as to how we got here in the first place. Unless you understand how you got here, you can't get out of here, don't you think? I'll go with
Exactly.
Krishnaji first.
Yes. Yeah, that you framed precisely our thought process as well. Until you fully deconstruct the current discourse and understand it and to internalize it, you can't get out of it. Because the discourse is so broad and so vast and covers so many parts of life. And I remember an academic paper that talked about the challenges of how Hinduism is presented in a nursing textbook on how to deal with end-of-life care for Hindus. And we recently had a conversation with a friend who's a world-leading researcher in AI. And he wanted to present a paper on decolonizing AI. And he used a Hindu framework. And we see everyone everywhere is struggling because this framework, this specific framework we're talking about from James Mill, and its sensitive, politically cleaned up language impacts all of us. The first question that blocks everything is caste. It doesn't matter that you're not talking about caste. It comes up, and if you haven't addressed it in a way that's satisfactory to a reviewer, you can't get past. Right? So if you look at any work that's influenced so broadly by this, right? Kundanji just talked about the fact that even those building the narrative, they have to answer to the narrative and answer in relationship to the narrative. This is why they get twisted up. And if you don't do that, you can't build your own narrative. That's the wrong starting point for building your own narrative. You have to build your own narrative on your own terms. But you can't do that until, one, you learn you're not on your own land, on your own terms to begin with, and most people don't realize that. I would say, honestly, well, we may have been intuitive about it. Neither of us knew that quite as much as we do now before we started this project. This was learning for us. And so until you fully deconstruct and understand and internalize the deconstruction, you cannot build a narrative on your own terms. It's just a fundamental truth.
Dr. Singh.
Yes. So just building on what Krishna said, our framework consists of deconstruction and reconstruction. In fact, we'll come to reconstruction much later. I would say that we have just begun at this point in time. This is our first cut as far as deconstruction is concerned. We are going to deconstruct more. And as a part of that deconstruction process, for you, Sreeji, and for your viewers, I want to talk about a little bit, regarding the influence that history of British India had on India. So, as I mentioned earlier, the history of British India got published in 1817. In 1819, James Mill got hired by the East India Company. By the time it was 1823, James Mill was second in command of all the officials who were operating from the headquarters of the East India Company in London. And he was looking after the revenue department. By the time it was 1830, James Mill became the chief. So above him, you only had the board of directors of the East India Company with its president, who was a British parliamentarian. So this was the kind of stature that James Mill acquired in his life. So there were certain things that happened, after the production of this book. The first one was that this book became the required reading for the East India Company officials who were getting trained at Haileybury College. So they learned this discourse before they went to India. Now, James Mill was also a political figure, and he was deeply involved with the utilitarian reforms that happened in Britain in the early part of the 19th century. And as a part of that process, he was crucial in establishing the University of London, which incidentally was created in opposition to Oxford and Cambridge. But that aside, this narrative began to become part of academia. And much later, when you have the first publications on the history of India from Oxford and, and Cambridge University Press, they basically reflect the paradigm of the history of British India by James Mill. So, James Mill is the paradigm determiner of India and Hinduism studies. First in the Western world, and because this framework was replicated in India through the establishment of universities post Macaulay that we all know about, this discourse became part of the Indian educational system. And that is why you will find the reflection of this discourse on contemporary thinkers like Ramila Thapar, well, R.S. Sharma, just passed away, but there are many historians who are regurgitating this discourse in a politically correct and sanitized form. So that is what is happening. So, you know, the current discourse, the current mainstream discourse that you find in India on ancient history, in Indian history and Hinduism, is not only Marxist and leftist in orientation, it is also colonialist in orientation, and they have the roots in James Mill's History of British India. And that's why it becomes extremely important, for people to really uh, learn about his writings. In fact, I would make an appeal to uh, all Hindu scholars. They should go through these 7 chapters. It would be painful. It's because it's a relentless attack from him as you go through those 7 chapters. But those 7 chapters have to be absorbed, and in the light, our book has to be read, and that is when one will begin to understand, what this discourse is doing to our present. It is not only affecting the present, of our Indian American children here. They are affecting everybody, from children to to adults and to people, who are on their deathbeds. Nobody is
So
immune
just
from this discourse. Yes, Krishna.
so one thing I'll add is if you think about scholarship and what you react to, right? We're 200 years deep into the scholarship, a little bit more. So you say, okay, I want to fix the current generation of scholars because those are the ones I interact with. Let me go attack them. Well, then you're attacking them, but you're still taking what they received, right? Which is the 6th generation. And I used 7th a little bit loosely, right? And 6th a little bit loosely. 1 generation above. Maybe you go 2 generations above. So fundamentally, everything you try to correct is still within the paradigm of James Mill. Who thinks to go back 7 generations to a root that no one has heard of? Many of these scholars themselves haven't read James Mill. You don't go back that far. You build upon what you received. And you try to correct what you received. Not so far back in history.
Thank you so much. And viewers, I would request now all of you to get this book. And Krishna ji, maybe you can explain to us where it's available. It's available. I'm hoping that it's available in easy to get stores like Amazon. Is it worldwide? Is it ebook available? Tell us a little bit about where we can get the book.
It is available worldwide. While it's listed on Amazon, it tends to be out of stock on Amazon. What we encourage people is to go to Springer. So search for the book by title on Google. You'll find a link to Springer. And there you can get the ebook for free. It's available via open access. And if you want to purchase it, it does ship globally. So no matter where you are in the world, you can order a copy there and they will ship it to your house. And
That's
we can
wonderful.
share a link afterwards along with this.
If you can
interview.
if you can give me the link, I'll add that thing as part of the description section in the video so people can easily access that. I'll also pin that as a comment so that anyone who comes in to look at the comments, they'll see this at the top, so they can click on that and get the book. Thank you very much, gentlemen. You certainly have opened up my eyes. I did not know of James Smith. Honest to God, I did not know of this. The only thing that struck me was this is not something that's unique to United States. This must be something that was before that. That was the only thing that I was going with when I asked that question. But Professor Singh, that was a great revelation. See, this is one good reason why you should read this book, guys. Very, very important point. Thank you so much, both of you. Namaskar.
Namaskar. Thank you.
Namaskar.